Yeah, thank you. I don't know whether the slides went a bit funny there, but not sure why. Thank you to, I guess, Rick, Anna, and Dan. There's a lot of things that I potentially don't have to go through now. During my talk, it's interesting that we're all talking about the same topic three in a row. So lots of different perspectives. I think you might have YouTube on in the background. Can somebody's not muted? Okay. Sorry, guys. I think one of you are. Yeah, there we go. I was hearing myself. I guess yeah. My topic is how Log4J ruined Christmas. I did want to put a lot of Christmas gifts and all that kind of stuff in, but time ran away from me, and unfortunately, I'm stuck with just a normal template. But hopefully, the actual content will cover that off. So just to move on. Who am I? I'm head of cyber resilience at Bank of Ireland, obviously in Ireland. I lead out security incident response, security testing, and threat intelligence for the bank. Also a former global board of director member. I held the role of chair, vice chair, and secretary within OWASP for the last 4 years. Over the last 4 years, and also a lecturer, and created a few master's degrees and diplomas in cybersecurity. So I'd like to give back to the community and make sure that the community is learning what the industry actually is looking for. So we've heard we've heard from the previous speakers a lot about what is on this slide. But I guess the key things here are that so there was three CVSS scores that came out from three different vulnerabilities, 10, 9, and 6. So the 6 was in relation to a denial of service attack, which could only be exploited from an internal attacker. So you'd require somebody that was already on your network in order to exploit it. Whereas the 9 and 10 were externally exploitable through a deserialization vulnerability. So within the first 24 hours, the vulnerability had a number of exploits circulating across the web, especially on GitHub. This actually made it pretty useful for, say, the likes of myself and my team, because with those exploits coming out, we were able to, I guess, validate our external perimeter using similar exploits to what the attackers were using. And the fact that I guess that this was something that affected pretty much nearly every technology on the internet all over the world, many software applications, many applications that you probably don't already know about. It's widely considered to be the most serious security vulnerability encountered in recent times. So I guess when we're looking at it, we're looking at obviously 2.x. 1.x was mentioned earlier on. There are remote code execution vulnerabilities in 1.x. A lot of people have moved away from it, but there are still organizations that have to utilize 1.x based on the fact that they're using legacy systems. 2.x, I guess there's multiple different versions. There was multiple different I guess exploits against different point in time versions, and then I guess when the vulnerability was patched, the big pain was that as I think Rick mentioned earlier on, the vulnerability there was a patch, and then a day later there was another patch, and then a day later there was another patch. And the issue there was that when you're like in organizations that have maybe 1,500, 10,000 applications, you have a lot to go through to identify whether it is vulnerable, whether you are at risk from this. So just to call out, I guess a few news articles, and some of them are like long live Log4Shell. It's not dead yet, and that's because there is a long tail on this particular vulnerability, based on the fact that even to date there are a number of software packages that haven't released patches for it, and they're some of the biggest software packages in the world, widely utilized by organizations all over the world. Like I guess UK companies face fine if you don't patch Log4j vulnerability. That's a big call in my eyes, based on the fact that there are a number of different other vulnerabilities that are out there that organizations are vulnerable to, but they're not being fined by that. So for those, but there are a number of different news articles, including Dutch cybersecurity agency warns lingering Log4j. As I mentioned, it is one of those vulnerabilities that's going to last a long time, with a long tail on it. And now, like, it is kind of the gift that keeps on giving, given the looking at the Christmas theme, with the 1.x vulnerability. I don't talk about it here in the slides, but I'll give a quick overview. So 1.x, it is externally exploitable to a deserialization vulnerability, but only if you use a log viewer called Chainsaw, which is a package that is part of Log4j 1.x, but it's only if you have it configured and you actually utilize it. That once you view a log with a serialized message in it, that it will deserialize and execute the payload. But back to 2.x. One of the things that I don't think we talked about today was the actual attack itself. And I come from an attack background, having spent 11 years in pen testing and red teaming. So I guess just to give a quick overview, and I have noticed as I was looking through my slides that there's 2 number trees. So that's going to annoy me now. So the first, from an attacker's perspective, what they would do is they would send a GET request with a payload, payload in the request. It didn't really matter where it was injected into, based on the fact that the majority of, say, applications and the logs that are coming from applications, they log, say, a GET request, POST request, including the headers. So in here, the payload is injected into the user agent header. A lot of organizations use that to identify whether there's any stability issues with the application based on what users are accessing their sites from. So it's an important thing to log. So as you can see, that payload is then passed to the server with the vulnerable Log4j instance, and then Log4j very nicely parses that and then queries the malicious LDAP server, as the request is LDAP to evil.com. And then from there, the LDAP server responds with, I guess, directory information or a payload. And instances, and I'll talk about it later on, there are a number of instances where a payload was then downloaded onto that particular server. I'll go through that in a few minutes. So as I mentioned, so the attacker might say, I guess, when they're trying to exploit this, they set the malicious Java class on the attacker-controlled LDAP server. But then, I guess, the lookup function will be used to execute the malicious class on the remote LDAP server. Once that exploit exceeds, depending on the contents of the URL in the lookup, the server then interprets the string. This might then lead to arbitrary shell commands in various forms, like Java class, JavaScript, or Unix shell, among others. So once something is executed, what an attacker looks to do is laterally move from the affected server. It was observed in the wild that using Cobalt Strike components that are normally used for lateral movement, that they were downloaded onto victim machines. And I will talk about the affected industries in a couple of slides. So these can be then used for lateral movement and might lead to a possible ransomware infection. As say the Cobalt Strike components have been observed for variety of ransomware attacks. It's generally the tool of choice when an attacker is trying to exploit an individual. And then you would move on to, say, credential access. And once you gain a set of credentials, attempt to laterally move across the network and keep on going until you get an account with elevated privileges, or you are able to exploit a vulnerability on the internal network that gives you those elevated privileges. And then it's all about trophy gathering at that point. And just sorry, my keyboard doesn't seem to be working. So from the attack itself, so within the first 12 hours, the vulnerability was detected. 40,000 attempts at exploiting Log4J. Now, these were all spray and pray attacks based on what I said earlier on. The exploit code and POCs were on GitHub, so everybody was trying it against a number of organizations. So the 40,000 then grew to 120,000 within 24 hours of the detection. By the 36-hour mark, there had been 400,000 attempts using the Log4j vulnerability. The rate of attacks then steadily climbed from this point, reaching a peak of 830,000 at the 72-hour mark. So as you can see, so the vulnerability was released, and then there was a significant amount of attacks as a result. So the increasing rate of attack as time progressed could have a number of underlying causes based on the fact that many organizations are being attacked, and if they don't have the correct tooling in place, they may not know that they were attacked. Is the issue. So, and I guess every organization seen there was a lot of spray and pray attacks. A lot of those attacks were actually coming from Tor exit nodes. So looking at the Tor, so the actual official Tor website, the Onion project, and you can actually get a list of, I think, 1,600, 1,700 official exit nodes. Now there are like potentially 10,000 exit nodes, but from an official exit node perspective, one of the mitigations was would have been to block those, because like I think we seen 80% of the spray and pray attacks for this vulnerability were coming from those exit nodes. So luckily enough, we utilize network monitoring tools on our DMZ, so we can analyze and trace that kind of traffic. In the event that we need to forensically analyze whether, say, somebody has attacked us, where it went, and so on. So that's a good control to put in place. So on this slide, you can see the attacks by industry and attacks by device type. So Log4j was exploited across a wide variety of sectors. To be honest, it didn't really matter to the sector. I think it was just a number of chancers, spray and praise. If they were able to exploit it, what could they do? What benefit could they get? Financial services was by far the biggest hit, making up nearly a third of the affected industries. So it illustrates clearly how attackers prioritize financial services and institutions in their attempts to exploit Log4j. But saying that, as I mentioned, like given the wide variety of industries, it was literally just who can I affect and what can I get from an attacker's standpoint. By device, so you can see there virtual machines were one of the biggest, and that's based on the fact that Java is widely used in virtual machines. You can also see a number of different devices there, all very heavy on from a Java perspective. in nearly half the cases, computer servers were, say, target of the attacks. The attackers exploited not just servers, but cameras, network access points, gateways, etc. So, like, there's a wide variety of attacks, going back to the point where it was just, and I seen it on our external perimeter, a significant amount of spray and pray and automated attacks, which if something was exploited, then obviously an attacker will zone in and on that particular vulnerable server or device. So going back to, I guess, the chain of attacks and what the mitigations are for mitigating against the Log4j, Log4Shell vulnerability. So the first one, disable Log4j library. So disabling the software obviously is the most effective measure, but as we heard in the first talk, even rolling back the version of Log4j caused logging to stop working. So by disabling or even changing anything, there's a lot of regression testing and back to my point where organizations, they not only have, say, 5-10 applications where it might be quite easy to get a handle of. There's just thousands and thousands of applications in some organizations, and to disable on all those applications is a huge task while maintaining service, because as you know, financial services is highly regulated. So any downtime is there's a potential fine. So disabling the GINDI lookups or disabling row code bases. So this option, while effective, may involve developer work and could impact functionality. So again, lots of regression testing, and given the amount of attacks that were going on within a short space of time, it's not really a viable option. Disconnect affected stacks, so solution stacks not connected to networks pose a dramatic lower risk from an attack. So it could be considered to temporarily disable those from third parties that were affected. But a lot of organizations utilize third parties in a significant manner. Isolate the system, so create a vulnerable network VLAN. So yes, it's vulnerable, but if you're exploited in a VLAN and don't actually implement the correct ACLs and on that VLAN, then somebody that is able to exploit this can then naturally move across the network, and it's only a matter of time before they're able to exploit something. So something that came out quick, but not so quick, were WAF rules for this. And then you get into the realm of, is the WAF configured correctly? So from my consulting background, I've seen a lot of clients where WAF was never configured to block. It was only configured in monitor mode or a passive mode, so that it didn't affect the normal workings of the application. In most instances, this was the case. So therefore, even though WAF rules come out, something that's not in blocking mode means that you can only tell whether there's that attack pattern being executed against your applications. And then there were several micro patches, but as was discussed earlier on, those micro patches, it resulted in countless number of wasted man hours in the remediation efforts when they just had to start from scratch. So a lot of what happened over the whole Christmas period was that a lot of people were already tired, as discussed in the first talk, from quite a busy year, and then their year got extended. No holidays for a lot of people, based on the fact that there was such a significant issue or potential issue to organizations. So going on to the problem and what we face now. So as you can see in the article from the Wall Street Journal, so 2 months on, many developers are still downloading the flawed Log4j tool. So whether this be to development environments or whether they're committing to production, they're looking at vulnerable, or they're downloading vulnerable software and then bringing it into production potentially, and thus causing a potential impact to the organization. So as I mentioned, organizations can have thousands and thousands of applications, but not only that, but the Log4j vulnerability affected software. So who has a asset of all software, as Dan mentioned, SBOMs, understanding how the stack of how your software is built, who has an asset, who has an inventory of all applications when different departments within an organization go out and potentially have applications from hosted on third parties that are technically owned by you, but you don't have the understanding of those. How do you find it, first of all? So a lot of people, and I've seen it in many organizations, they relied on vulnerability scanning tools. But to rely on vulnerability scanning tools, you have to rely on them releasing a signature for that particular vulnerability. So without the SBOM, you don't know what you have on your estate. Tools like Qualys, Nessus, they release signatures for these particular issues. Then once you have the signature, you need to scan your entire estate. So in most instances, the vulnerability resulted in, say for instance, it was exploitable. So tools like Qualys could actually simulate an attacker and call back to one of their servers and tell you that you are vulnerable. There were other QIDs that were identified one instance of say Log4j based on processes or services that were listening on ports. But what happens if that kind of thing happens if you do an unauthenticated scan? If you do an authenticated scan, then you have a lot more information from registry and program files and stuff like that. But again, it's signature based. So at those early points, none of us knew the extent of this, of the vulnerability. Yes, in all Java, but as there isn't the SBOM, you weren't aware of your vendors, third-party software on your estate that were potentially impacted by this. And then based on the fact that you are reliant on signatures to identify something, the signatures didn't identify everything. There are other vulnerable software packages out there that there are signatures for still. So do you script things like, I've heard of organizations where they've had maybe, say 1,000 vulnerable instances, which were identified by one of these vulnerability management tools. And then when they actually looked at it over the entire estate, they found tens of thousands of instances of Log4j of the jar on their estate. But so going down a rabbit hole, tens of thousands, are they actually impactful? Not all of them are impactful, and therefore, looking at the two CVEs there at the bottom that are related to remote code execution, the 9 and the 10, they're the ones that should be focused on. So without going down the rabbit hole of trying to fix every single piece of software on your estate, looking at the actual vulnerable versions of the software and fixing those are probably the best approach to this, to fixing the problem. So there were also a few quickish fixes. So for different versions of Log4j, there was like disable the lookups, but that proved to be bypassed fairly quickly. So a lot of organizations, their strategy was to apply the mitigations based on the fact that the mitigation was just disable this lookup, and then you don't have to do any regression testing. So not all organizations were had the misfortune of going through that, but it's something that, as it was easily exploitable, or found to be exploitable, it was a waste of time. For all 2.x versions, there was removing the vulnerable class, and there's a script there that could be run against every server to remove that class, based on the fact that it's in a particular directory on the application server. So that was something that was proven to be a quick fix, but not knowing where the software was, it was kind of like an internal spray and pray for most organizations. So things that you can do that I certainly found very useful was that evaluating the external perimeter. As I mentioned earlier on, there was a number of POCs and that were released on the external perimeter on GitHub. So as you can see here on the right hand side, so it's possible to utilize tools like burp, zap, in order to see whether an application can be injected into, by injecting into headers, and see whether you get a call back to an external service. So apply and monitor IOCs. So something that I don't think anybody mentioned, but from a security point of view, there was a significant amount of IOCs that were out there. So IOCs are pieces of forensic information, indicators of compromise, that are released online. And the challenge with IOCs is that in most cases, you find that there's legitimate software or applications that are added or IPs that are added, which could potentially cause impact to service. But in other cases, the IOCs could be the IPs of servers that have tried to exploit other organizations. So therefore, blocking them are useful. It's useful, but if you just recycle your IP, you can just go again. So you end up with a significant amount of IOCs being blocked on your gateway. In relation to IOCs, I mentioned network monitoring. So applying those IOCs to a network monitoring tool at your in your DMZ is something very useful and important to look at, based on the fact that you can see that a particular external IP has connected to an application and injected the attack vector. And you can actually track the flow of that vector and whether there's a server downstream that does actually respond to that attack vector. So it's quite useful. I mentioned earlier on about blocking Tor nodes. So there is the 9000 unofficial, but if you're to block the 9000 unofficial, based on IP cycling and stuff like that, then you can't be guaranteed that you're not going to block a legitimate site and could cause the service impact that I mentioned. It's important to continue to monitor the Log4j assets closely. So as I mentioned, it's a long tail. Some organizations have thousands and thousands of applications that need to be patched. And with that, it's not something that's going to happen very quickly. So it's important to utilize, say, your monitoring capability within your organization to monitor those assets, and then monitor and look for malicious activity based on the exploit strings. It is also important to note that many application servers, even though you obfuscate something, the application server will be obfuscated because application servers are work that way, and then can still exploit it. So it's not about just looking for the initial attack vector, but variants of it, which is why looking at the IOCs are important. So an important thing and a lesson learned, I guess, throughout this whole incident was that so yes, you could look on Twitter, you could look on Reddit, numerous number of locations, but the most important place to look was the official Apache website that referenced the Log4j vulnerabilities. and whether there were what the mitigation steps were, what patches were available. The only thing that it didn't note fairly quickly was that different versions were vulnerable, which is why looking at different sources and having access to different sources is important. So also like blocking specific outbound network traffic. So outbound LDAP, who uses outbound LDAP? So unless you're in a hybrid cloud approach, which you could be, LDAP may never be used. So evaluating that, blocking it is a very quick and easy fix. Same way with remote method invocation and outbound DNS. So most organizations, they use an internal DNS server. So there should be no calls out to an external DNS server. That and the accumulation of IOCs from the last number of big attacks, blocking those is very useful in stemming this kind of attack. We mentioned, or S-bombs were mentioned a lot, but I won't labor them. But good security posture is very, very important. So in order to successfully exploit Log4j vulnerability, the attacker must be able to instruct the vulnerable host to download Java classes from a host they control, so an external host. That means that they need to be able to establish the connection outside of the organization, and that the victim machine downloads those classes or the attack vector. This is where normal or good old network security practices come in. So why would you allow a server in your network to open an outbound LDAP connection to the internet? So local firewalls on those servers, or even on your external firewall, blocking outbound connections from an LDAP perspective is very important. So understanding the attack paths and threat models. So the most intriguing thing about the Log4j vulnerability is that the ways in which it can be exploited are only limited to the imagination and the expertise of the attacker. So these examples using common HTTP headers were used because it's very common that applications write those headers to the logs, writing the received content in logs, which is then triggers the vulnerability. But virtually any application input could be the exploit. Detection must go beyond the first exploit. So it needs to go to blue teams. Security vendors were quick to respond with signatures, policies, and rule-based detections, and to block the first reserved attacks. However, what we saw was that a series of quick actions to create content designed to detect those specific attacks only. Although the content would certainly help you to see that those attempts against your environment, they were focused on static indicators or compromise, and in attacks using different or even slightly different vectors were very efficient and were likely to be missed by your detection capabilities. Like Dan, I've added a lot of useful content. Unfortunately, I didn't add the OWASP links, but there are a number of different useful resources on this page. And just going back to it, there are multiple sources. Not all the sources are very useful. There's some very technical sources which, when putting this slide deck together, were very useful to me. But it's about understanding the issue, understanding your environment, and then understanding how to fix it, and the plan, and putting a plan in place to actually fix it. And like many the remediation efforts of this are going to go on for a long period of time. But as I mentioned, the most important thing is to patch or remove vulnerabilities that are the 9s and 10s, which can be externally exploitable. So once they're patched, or if they're segregated in some way, or if you block LDAP requests going out, those kind of things, just in order to apply mitigation and add that layer of depth into your defense process. And with that, I'll take any questions. Hopefully I didn't go over too much that the others talked about, but always available to take any questions, and either on this or outside of this.